Hello and welcome to CPA Ontario's Practical Experience webinar on Technical Competency Documentation. My name is Hassan Tabakwala and I am a specialist with the Employer Relations team. Before we begin today, we would like to acknowledge our CPA students for showing resilience and staying determined during these uncertain and challenging times. We hope you are all in good health and taking care of yourselves and your families. This webinar was designed specifically for experience verification students, to provide a framework for documenting technical competency responses and to provide clarification on level 1 versus level 2 proficiencies in commonly reported CPA subcompetencies. Please note that we will be holding back questions during the presentation part of our session today, as the focus should be on listening to the content being reviewed in the slides. Please note all webinar attendees are muted. Should you have questions at the end of the webinar, you are welcome to ask your question via the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and our team of practical experience experts will be happy to assist. All attendees will be receiving a recording of the webinar 24 hours after its completion. I'm joined today by Raj Singh and Amanda Lee Show, two of our officers in the Employer Relations team. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Hassan. Before we begin today, we'd like to run a quick poll just to understand where you feel your current depth area is in your role. So we'll just pull up this poll very quickly, and if you can respond, that would be greatly appreciated. And you should see the poll on your screen now. So if you can please pick one of those 6 options, that would be great. And I think we can close this poll now, Hassan. So we are using new technology today, so please do bear with us. There might be some delays with the technology. Looks like folks are still answering, so we'll give it a few more seconds. Now we do have a few people that say they haven't seen the poll, so I'm not sure if the poll is visible on the other end. Okay. So for now, let's skip this poll. If people did respond, we will loop back to the poll, but I'm not sure if it has run.
Hi, Raj. Yeah, it looks like it did run, and we had about a 90% completion on the poll. It should have popped up as a pop-up for those of you who didn't see it.
Okay, and
we're going to close it.
Perfect.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody in the chat for confirming.
And can we see these results? Perfect. So about 45% of you look like you have a depth in financial reporting, another 34% in management accounting, and a few people that may feel strategy and finance may be their area of depth, and a little bit in tax and assurance, but it looks like the majority of this audience is either financial reporting or management accounting, as we would expect with EVR students. So thank you very much. That gives us some great insight into the audience today. Now, before we begin, what we want to do as well is demonstrate the competency tree that was recently created on our website. So we received consistent feedback from our students that they need better resources to help better understand the PE competencies, the proficiency levels, the core depth and the breadth requirements. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to walk you through the newly designed PE competency pages, and I encourage you to explore these pages and provide us feedback in a short survey that you will all receive after this presentation. Excellent. So you should be able to see my screen here. Now, this is the newly introduced practical experience competency pages. And what you will notice is at the very top, we do explain these are the 6 technical competency areas, and as well, there is enabling competencies that you have to develop over a 30-month period. Now, as you navigate on these pages, we get into further and further detail to help you understand what these competencies and sub-competencies mean. For example, like if I was a student and I had exposure to accounting policies and transactions, what I would do, I would select FR2 and read a little bit more about what it means to have competency in this sub-competency area. So you will find there's leading questions that help you understand what that underlying sub-competency area is all about. So you can click on any one of these sub-competency areas to learn more about the underlying sub-competency as you navigate on the website. We've also talked more about progressions. So one of the things students struggle with often is, what's the difference between a level 0 versus a level 1 versus a level 2? And the concept of progression is now explained through the concept of a bud, a leaf, and eventually what looks like an apple or a fruit through the utilization of a tree. So, at a level 0, you would be explaining, calculating, and recording, versus at a level 1, you'd be analyzing, identifying, and researching and preparing. And then finally, at a level 2, you would be involved in developing, reviewing, and advising. So getting into the recommendation piece. So at the very bottom, what you will also find is the concept of the tree. So really, when we look at core, if we click on that requirement, what you will see is this is one way to develop your core, developing 3 level 1s, or those 3 leaves in FR1, MA2, and MA1. Now we look at depth. And to develop depth, here's one example where a student developed 2 level 2s, those 2 fruits, and the 1 leaf under finance to develop their depth. And then finally, here's an example of breadth. So really, how does a student develop breadth? It's 4 level 2s and 4 level 1s. So what you'll notice is there's 4 fruits on this tree and 4 leaves on this tree to demonstrate the final breadth requirement. And then finally, the enabling is demonstrated through the tree again, but these are the 5 level 2s that you would develop for your enabling competency. And what we encourage you to do is actually click on build your own competency tree, where you can self-select different combinations of developing your core, breadth, and depth. So we highly encourage you to pay close attention to these pages and to visit this part of the website. So this is something I wanted to showcase, and we will also be asking you for your feedback on this area of the website. So now let's flip back to the presentation. So I'm just going to get Hassan to pull up the presentation, and we'll head right into what we're covering today. Perfect. And we can just go to the next slide, Hassan. Perfect. So today we're going to be covering a number of examples. So a few things that we have to cover. Please note that the experience responses that you provide in PERT must be in your own words, and they must be verified by your reporting manager. Students are reminded that plagiarism or any other form of academic misconduct are contained in the academic code. So please make sure you look at the student code. As a disclaimer on the next page, all these examples are for presentation purposes only. So they're illustrative in nature. Note that the length of these responses may not be illustrated of the level of detail required in every situation. So each student scenario will vary, and the level of detail required in the responses may also vary. So we do have to let you know that. Now I'm going to turn it over to Amanda, who's going to start off with the presentation.
Awesome. Hassan, you can move forward 2 slides. Actually, we had a little disclaimer Raj already mentioned. Everybody's scenario is different. So what we're trying to do today is show you a variety of examples and explain what us reviewers are looking for at a higher level, so that this can help you draft your responses. So before we get started deep into, some of these subcompetency areas, and we have done a little bit of work in all of the areas, understanding that most of you do focus on financial reporting or management accounting. So those are the more heavier areas that we're going to cover today. Overall, I did want to provide some tips and tricks informing your response to us. And so we would definitely recommend watching this How to Report in PERT EVR video series, as well as pay close attention to the rubric found in Appendix A and our guiding questions document. So those are three different things. One's a video, one's a rubric, which is, the requirement. And we've drafted the guiding questions to help you as a guide, to lead you in questions that we as reviewers typically ask when we review all of the subcompetencies. So they are great resources. Overall, though, what will help us in determining, whether you're 0 or a level 1 or a level 2 are a couple of additional things. So, for example, one of them is time and frequency. So if in your report you are outlining to us, I prepare financial statements, it would really help us to understand I prepare monthly, quarterly, and annual financial statements, so us as reviewers have an understanding of the frequency that you prepare this task. Is it a one-time project, or is it a routine sort of transactional routine occurrence? If it is a one-time project, well, how long did you spend on this project? Because if it was a 1-week project, well, maybe you didn't really develop any competencies. But if it was, let's say, a 5-month project or something ongoing at the organization, then there is definitely potential there. The other thing would be to quantify where possible. So what I'm trying to mean there is include anything, within your own abilities that include maybe dollar ranges, so we can better understand the scope and materiality of the projects you're working on. I'm just going to take a quick pause. I see folks are messaging through the chat. That is not the way you should be asking questions. You should be doing it through the Q&A panel. Every time you ask a question, it will pop up for everybody. Please do it through the Q&A. Okay. And so quantify, so any type of size, dollar value of the budgets you're working on, etc. And then finally, when you are trying to achieve that level 2, we want you to spend less time on background. We often find students give us like 70% of the responses background, and then at the very end, they sort of write, and this is my recommendation. We still need the background, of course, but really focus on, this is the background, this is what you need to know, Mr. or Mrs. Reviewer. Here's how I did my analysis, and here's how I provided the recommendation. We would also advise to avoid using we statements. So make sure you're saying, I did this and I did that. Attach any job descriptions or organizational charts where possible. So if your job or your role changed since your pre-assessment and you've sort of been promoted or new things have added to your role, that's great for us to know. And then include examples of your work where possible. And so Hassan, you could go to the next slide, but on that topic of include work where possible, we definitely have scenarios as reviewers where we may ask for additional information. And so some of those scenarios may be asking you for a breakdown of chargeable hours. And this is typically done for students in firm environments. In cases where perhaps a student does not have assurance time, we may ask for even further information, like samples of compilation statements you've prepared. If you're working in industries where you might have a client portfolio, so a property accountant, real estate roles, even fund accountants and so forth, we typically ask for a breakdown of your portfolio. Sometimes we may ask for financial statements, org charts, updated job descriptions for roles that we are deemed to be higher risk. And we'll talk about what that means in the next slide. And further, to get some comfort, sometimes we like to speak to your supervisor or your mentor, your organization's auditor, if there's any board of director members who are CPAs, again, to gain comfort in some of these roles that we deem to be higher risk. Overall, sometimes students will say, well, why do I have to do this? Why are you asking me these questions? And from, taking a big step back, we are all CPA reviewers. We all know, majority of what students are working on and can get an idea, but at the end of the day, we don't know the specific details of your role, of your organization. And so to make sure we're upholding the standards of the organization, sometimes we have to ask for this additional information. And so students are required to comply. And there's a couple of sections, whether it's in the student code of conduct or in our PER, that outlines why students are required to cooperate with officers on acting on behalf of regulatory processes. And on top of that, should you be concerned about any type of confidentiality issues, us reviewers are CPAs, and we are bound by the CPA Ontario Act for the members. And so this basically acts as a non-disclosure agreement on our behalf, because we're only using those informations in order to assess your competency, and then we'll move forward from there. And then on our next slide, we are just also wanted to outline achieving depth in a competency-based area. And so what that means is just something else we wanted to outline to our students is there is also a requirement that if you are earning a depth in financial reporting, audit and assurance, or taxation, that you must earn a minimum of 6 months exposure to the Canadian standard or equivalent. So what that means for financial reporting is any generally accepted accounting principles, so IFRS, ASPE. For audit and assurance, we have a list of the different standards here. And for taxation, it's the Canadian Income Tax Act. So that means if you are working, let's say in US tax, you do need to get a rotation at least 6 months into using into Canadian tax, whereby you'll have Canadian Income Tax Act exposure. And finally, before we move on to just overall each of our competency areas, it's important for us to just let you know some factors we are considering in assessing what makes a role risk higher or lower. And definitely want to outline that these are not looked at in isolation, but rather factored together, and everybody's role is different. And when you submit an assessment to us based on what we understand of your role, we will assess what that risk is and work with you to either mitigate that risk and answer a bunch of questions so that we can give you the right advice to move forward or help you understand, your next steps. So some things we look at are the number of employees at the organization, whether you have a CPA as a supervisor or CPAs who work at the organization. In combination, sometimes we'll look at what the annual revenues are for your organization and what types of financial statement light items you might have exposure to, who your stakeholders are and what the reporting requirements are for your organization, your job description, and the industry. So by no means do we say, oh, your supervisor is not a CPA, you can't get the designation. That's absolutely not true. What we do look for is just assessing all of these different sort of scenarios and criteria to make sure that you're in a role that will allow for you to earn your core depth and breadth based on the complexity and diversity available at the organization. So we will definitely, elaborate a little bit more there, but absolutely nothing is looked at in isolation, and we consider everything holistically. Okay, so now we have, we're going to move into financial reporting, which is one of our big areas. And before we, get going on what makes financial reporting, I also wanted to outline chargeable hours. So, and this is typically, this is only applicable for students who are providing accounting services to the public in a firm environment. But typically, in order to achieve a level 2, when we're talking about financial reporting here in public practice, is to also get a combination of your compilation engagement exposure, but also your 425 assurance hours. So that could be audit, that could be review, or that could be a mix. But that will be your easiest way to get those hours. Get those level 2s. Of course, we can explore other options with you, but this is typically what we're looking for. Okay, so now let me just kind of high level explain what we've tried to achieve here, going through each of these competency areas. And as to remind you, we're not going to cover every single competency area, and we're not going to show level 2s in every single area or level 1s in every single area. But for the most part, what we're trying to demonstrate here is what makes something a level 1 versus 2 and what us reviewers consider. Okay, and so in this particular scenario, we're looking at financial reporting number 1, which is financial reporting needs and systems. And we have a student here who's working at an organization that's 500 employees, there's CPAs employed, their job or their title is a senior accountant, they report to a CPA, and they've been in the role for 12 months. So me as a reviewer is assessing overall that this role risk is low because the student is working in a large organization. We have over 100 employees. There are CPAs employed, and their role, as you can see, is a senior level role. So it doesn't automatically, alarm me in any way that, the role might be junior and limited in breadth. And so I would, as a reviewer, assess this as a low overall risk. And so here's an example of what a student might draft to us. That's a level 1 example. So one thing that's required is that we need to understand who your shareholders are or stakeholders are of your financial statements, and how you are working with the systems in order to create accurate or reliable external facing statements. So if you are working with, your reports and you're creating reports or creating custom reports that will later help management make a decision internally, that doesn't fall in this area. That falls in management accounting number 1. What falls in this area is working with reports, working with your systems, customizing reports, or generating reports for multiple systems and bringing them together in order to create accurate and reliable external facing financial statements. Okay. We often see students talk a lot about reconciliations in this area. That's a level 0. And then if we go to the next slide, what's considered for level 1? Well, the student was in the role for 12 months. So really not having enough exposure here to get this complex, give us some complex examples. And the complexity for level 2 is not there just yet. It's there for a level 1. So how does the student get to a level 2? So sure, most companies might not go through a financial system conversion or upgrade, of course, but if that was the case and a student didn't even lead, but worked through some of those conversations and creating reports and customizing reports, absolutely. Or they worked through any changes in standards and assessing, the impact for the organization, as well as, creating, modifying, and customizing reports, right, for the purpose of external facing accurate financial statements. And so in those cases, we look for about 3 to 5 examples of some reports you've created if you're not going through a large project like a system conversion or a change to the standard. For financial reporting number 2, we have another example here, and this example will demonstrate to you how we go from a 1 to a 2. So again, we have a student, they are in the manufacturing industry. They have over 200 employees, 1 to 5 CPAs employed, student reports to a controller, and their role is accountant. So overall in this scenario, I would also say this role risk is low. I would put a small caveat there to make sure and maybe visit the student's job description because accountant is so broad. I would want to make sure that the job description does have some focus outside of just standard bookkeeping and invoicing, and actually has a little bit more meat to the description, such as preparing statements or working on budgets or working on costing, to make sure that this role is in fact more intermediate to senior than a junior accountant. And so an example of a level 1, again, 12 months in the role, and the student's telling me they prepare routine entries such as accounts payable, receivable, accruals, and payroll. And they talk about some of the non-routine entries, which is also great for us to see. They talk about that, they prepare entries every time the company makes a capital purchase, and they look to this specific standard in order to assess how to prepare the entry. They also talk about preparing some of the deferred revenue transactions. So a couple of things here. When I look at a response like this is a great example of a level 1. student is experiencing a lot of routine transactions that involved low judgment, and then some non-routine transactions that do involve some judgment, but the student hasn't provided 3 to 5 complex examples to me at the moment for me to give them a level 2. So this is a very strong level 1. And in my feedback, I would advise the student continue to report in this area and continue to layer on examples, which is what they do in the next slide. So in our next slide, and Hassan, this is going to be fun for you because I'm going to need you to click a bunch of times, but hold on. Here's an example of what the student wrote for their update. So it's now been 21 months. So the student basically has close to 2 years of preparing entries. If you can click, Hassan, we have indication here. The student's providing background here and giving us as a reviewer, a split between routine and non-routine entries. So as a reviewer, I now can see, okay, 70% of the student's time, routine entries, that's great foundation for a level 1. Now they've had about 30% of non-routine entries that they're preparing. They've been doing that for the last almost 2 years. If you could click again, Hassan. We also see that the student has provided 3 to 5 examples of some of these non-routine entries that involve complexity. And so if you click again, Hassan, the complexity, and they reference the handbook sections they researched. So anytime a new transaction is ongoing, a new transaction comes up, if a student has to look to the handbook, research the requirements, and then prepare the entry, that also helps us indicate complexity. And then furthermore, highlighted the last piece is discusses factors of complexity. So I tried to highlight some areas that might jump out to me as areas of complexity where a little bit more analysis is required, first time work is required, right? Like a new lease agreement, reviewing impairment, assessing in analysis for the revenue amortization period, or multi-period deliverables, all those kinds of things add to the layers of complexity. And finally, overall, the student has had exposure to multiple operating cycles, which we've talked about. And finally, they've used the rubric and the guiding questions to prepare this response. So it met our level 2 requirements. And at the end, we understand that the student provides recommendations on how to prepare the entry. Thank you. So overall, we just talked about it, but things we've considered for level 2, duration in the role, right? How long, how many months of exposures? We see often students might have 6 months of exposures in a company and report all level 2s. We expect to see progression, and that progression comes in the latter half. There's complexity there. They provided 3 to 5 examples that involved analytical and judgment skills, and they definitely had the autonomy, right? They did it without guidance and provided those recommendations. Okay, so here's an example, and I've seen a lot of questions pop up as I've been presenting about what makes a scenario maybe a higher risk. And here's an example. So we get a student's profile here. They work in the professional services industry, and there's 34 employees and no CPAs employed. And their job title is general accountant. And they report to the owner, who's the CEO. So a couple of things that would cause us to believe that this role may be a higher risk is that there are minimal employees. There's 34 employees at the organization, and there are no CPAs employed. Now, while that doesn't mean that if there's no CPAs employed at your organization, or if your organization is under 100 employees, that you can't get your CPA, but these are scenarios where we would ask for more questions. And then we see the job title is general accountant. And so sometimes a general accountant, just like last time, right, when the title was accountant, sometimes it can go either way, right? Sometimes the general accountant may be doing bookkeeping and payroll and invoicing, and sometimes a general accountant might be doing financial statements, budgets, and analysis, right? So again, we would consider all of these towards the role risk. So as a result, in our next slide, the student is preparing us a response. The student says, I prepare the full set of financial statements for the company, and this does not include note disclosures as our statements are not audited and reviewed. They are prepared for tax purposes. I work on month-end closing entries, year-end adjustments and accruals, and compile the financial statements. I do this on a monthly basis, and I've prepared over 18 sets of monthly statements. Great. This is a scenario where CPA Ontario would assess the level of complexity here because we need to understand, right? While the student's doing great work, they're preparing financial statements, they've done a whole bunch, they've quantified, the number of times they've prepared for us. We now need to assess whether, based on the risk we've assessed earlier, if there is potential in this area for the student to earn a level 2. So in these cases, we would ask for financial statements. And if you go to the next slide, Hassan, here's a sample, let's say, and these are just generic statements from the internet. They don't belong to anybody. We assess the risk. So here are some information or some things found in these financial statements that support complexity. One of them is multiple revenue streams, and the other is long-term borrowing. But some things that don't offer complexity are size of the balances, right? Everything's quite small, simple and straightforward accounts mostly. There are no note disclosures. The statements are not audited or reviewed by a CPA, so there's no CPA supervision, in these statements. And statements are not prepared using an accounting set of standards, right? They're prepared for tax purposes. And so this, like the student gives us one set of statements because while they've prepared for 18 months, there's only been one annual set, so there's no comparatives. So in our conclusion at this point, we would probably assess that these statements are not complex enough to offer a level 2 in financial reporting, and stream a bigger conversation with us and the student and the employer about, is there sufficient complexity at all at the organization? So what do we consider for level 2 in financial reporting number 3? We do look at the size of the organization and their statements. There's no magic number particular, that we look for, but a good benchmark would be anywhere in the like 5 million or so. Is the student preparing, full sections of statements or the full set of statements? And if so, is it complex? And if it's just 1 or 4 or 2 sections, are those sections material to the statement, right? What impact does the student's work have to the statement? Are they preparing note disclosures? Are the statements subsequently audited or reviewed? Who is relying on them? And how many cycles is the student involved in? All of this will help us assess if there's complexity there, if you've got the right exposure to financial statement preparation, and if you're there for the level 2. Okay. Oops. I almost clicked leave webinar, folks. And our last one in financial reporting is financial statement analysis. So financial reporting number 4. And so again, here's just a standard example of somebody who we would assess to be in a low roll risk. Why? Great industry. We've got manufacturing. We know there's typically a lot of, inventory and different types of transactions associated with costing and all of that. We know it's a good size. It's over 100 employees. We have CPAs employed, accountant role, reports to a controller who's a CPA, and the student's been in the role for 12 months. And so this student talks about reviewing the monthly and quarterly statements for the last 12 months, and the analyze, Hassan, you can move to the next slide. And they analyze month over month, quarter over quarter, and year over year transactions for certain income statement balance sheet items. They review trends and go over with the assistance of their controller these trends and what they found in the statements to the board. So this is a great example of level 1, students doing analysis on actual to actual results and beginning to draw conclusion with the supervision of their controller. Okay. To get to the level 2, of course, we would expect a couple of things. We would expect an update on the duration, right? So this is now an update 24 months. So now the student's been doing this for 2 full operating cycles. They now assess interrelationships between multiple income statement and balance sheet items. They are, assessing the changes, analyzing any interrelated changes between the accounts. Their duties have now expanded to preparing, these results for the CFO and the board in the quarterly meetings. So no more help from the controller. And they're working through ratios and trends and providing recommendations. Okay. And so again, what are we considering as complex or to get to this level two? Duration definitely plays a factor. Recommendations. Are you making recommendations to these to the stakeholders or the owners of the organization based on your findings? How did you, find a variance and be able to draw the conclusion as to why the variance came about? All of those types of analysis turn your level one into level two, right? Are you leading the process and are you assessing these interrelationships, right? If you're just looking at did accounts receivable grow this year, yes or no, that's not enough for a level two. But if you're analyzing the change in accounts receivable, preparing, a ratio, looking at revenue in the year, looking at your cash balance and understanding the interdependencies across the different accounts to draw your conclusion, well, that's when you start taking steps into the direction of a level two. I also wanted to point out that we have a very common student error when we look at financial reporting number 4, and that relates to variance analysis. And that's nobody's fault because variance analysis comes up in 3 areas. And so I just thought it'd be a great opportunity right now to talk about why some of these areas get confused. So financial reporting number 4 is the focus on analyzing historical financial information. So year over year, quarter over quarter actuals. Okay. Management accounting, sometimes we see it in 2 or sometimes we see it in 3. This deals with internal management decision making. So budget to actual analysis for your variance. And finally, for finance 1, there's a little area that talks about assessing the entity's financial state. And so often students might be doing, a ratio analysis, a liquidity analysis, comparing industry to actual, and that's where you would see it there. So I'm going to stop talking now and I'll pass it on to Raj, who's going to cover management accounting, which is another one of our really big areas. And we'll continue.
Thank you so much, Amanda. So I'll be covering management accounting. So if you think about management accounting, it's all internal to your organization. It deals with non-standards-based reporting, but primarily information that information holders need inside your company. So let's take a quick look. We're going to talk about MA2, which is a very common subcompetency, planning, budgeting, and forecasting. In this situation, a student's working for a manufacturing company with approximately 300 people. There's 5 CPAs employed. The student's a financial analyst reporting to an FP&A manager. So all of that sounds really good because it would make sense that a financial analyst working in an FP&A area for a large manufacturing company or a mid-sized company would be getting this type of competency. So overall, from a reviewer perspective, we would say this is low in terms of risk. Now let's take a look at a sample level 1 response. So what the student here is articulating is, as part of the 2021 budget, I reviewed these inputs that came from sales operations managers for inclusion into my annual budget. I also reviewed these budget inputs because these were assumptions that were given to me. So before I just took this information and rolled it up, I actually analyzed it. Then I actually took this information and prepared the annual budget. And the student here is quantifying that it was a $30 million budget and it was a budget relating to the operating expenses. And then finally, the student says, once the annual budget was prepared and approved, then I was involved in the monthly meetings where I explained actual to budget variances. And then I assisted the stakeholders understand what these variances actually meant. So this would be a good example of a level 1. And what we're seeing here is the student basically went through one OPEX cycle of preparing that budget. Now, if we look at the same student on the next slide, here's an update at 24 months. So a lot of times students say, how do I get to a level 2? For routine competencies, once again, in management accounting, we are looking to see that you've had exposure to multiple cycles of that budget process. So now the student is saying, now I've done 2 annual operating budgets and 4 reforecasts in my role. I've also reviewed and adjusted growth-related assumptions as part of the annual budgets. So they're continuing to question those inputs into the budgets. The student has also worked on multiple budgets and the inputs for inclusion. So things like sales, cost of goods sold, operating expenses, fixed and variable costs, they're looking at multiple line items as part of their OpEx budget preparation. And then they've continued with the annual operating budget and the reforecast for a much bigger part of the budget exercise. And then finally, what the student also talks about is the fact that not only do they do the variance analysis, but they're also involved with recommendations to business leaders as part of their variance analysis post-budget. So let's take a quick look on the next slide. What was considered for level 2 here? Duration, obviously, multiple budget cycles, recommendations. They're involved in the analysis and the recommendation. The complexity at a level 2, there were multiple line items the student was actually budgeting for. And finally, closer to the end, you'll notice there was more autonomy. So the student was starting to lead that budgeting process as opposed to just assisting in the budget. So that was an example of a level 2 in MA2. So let's move on now to MA3. Lots to cover here, folks. So MA3, cost, revenue, profitability management. This student here works in a retail organization, about 150 people, 3 CPAs, and the role is as a revenue analyst, and the student is reporting into a revenue manager, and the student's at about 12 months of duration. So overall, we would consider this type of environment low in terms of risk. Now, moving into the student's example on the next slide, the student talks about how as a revenue analyst, they support the sales team. So in this sub-competency, they're targeting how revenue management applies to their role. So as part of this role, the student is doing product line analysis for one division. They're looking at contribution margin by product line. So this analysis is used by the sales director to understand which product lines are most profitable. So as part of this analysis, the student highlights the product lines that are not selling, the ones that contributed low margin to the overall profitability, but they're working with the manager and the sales director to help highlight, possibly these are the product lines that we should focus on. So this would be an example of a level 1. So now you guys are going to say, hey, what's a level 2 then? Because that sounds like a pretty good example. So now if we look at the next slide, we look at MA3 at a level 2. So you'll notice in the first slide, the student was only doing that work for about 12 months. Now we're up to 24 months. The other thing the student talks about is how they've progressed in their role. So before they were doing one type of analysis, and now the student is talking about how they performed 3 different types of revenue management analysis for their sales team. And what they're doing here, and I always encourage students to do it, when you are providing multiple examples, put in a number. So number 1, I do product mix analysis. Number 2, I do sales by product line analysis. And number 3, I also do sensitivity analysis as part of my role. And then the student starts talking about, this is what I do. So I prepare a monthly product mix analysis for 20 plus product lines, once again, quantifying what they're doing. They talk about how this analysis is complex and how they recommend different strategies, go-to-market strategies for the optimal product mix, what regions they should focus on, customers they should focus on. So this is the part where they're starting to get into all those recommendations. They start analyzing the sales by product line, which products are driving profitability. And then finally, they're also talking about recommendations related to discontinuing certain products, performing a sensitivity over multiple product line analysis. So this is where at a level 2, we're looking to see, is this something you've done once, maybe twice, or is it an ongoing part of your role? Have you done different types of analysis? So they've provided 3 solid examples here to get them to a level 2. So if we go to the next slide, what was considered for the level 2? Duration, obviously, but providing the multiple examples, 3 to 5 minimum, recommendations. Did their analysis lead to some sort of recommendation for the business? Were those examples actually complex in nature, or were they straightforward? And finally, did the student start leading, being part of the recommendation process to get them to the level 2? So that was MA3 in a nutshell. MA4, let's move on. So this is a very common one, organizational and individual performance management. In this case, the student works in a supply chain environment, also transportation, warehousing, another name for it. There's about 200 plus people in this organization. There's 2 CPAs employees, the students and analysts, and the supervisor is a finance manager. So at the end of the day, the student's been in there for about 12 months, but overall, not overly risky. It's a bit of a low risk environment, but let's talk more about this sub-competency and how the student at a level 1 responded. So he said, as an analyst in the supply chain industry, my role was to support these stakeholders. These are the root causes of performance issues that I analyze as part of my KPI analysis. So here the student talks about one KPI that they analyzed, and that was productivity by department. So they're clearly articulating, this is what the KPI is. It's the total shipments divided by the number of staff in that division. And they're saying, I measured that metric on a weekly basis. This is what I used it for. I help the divisional warehouse managers understand which divisions are most productive, which divisions may have productivity issues. Because it's one KPI, it's not overly complex. That would be a level 1 example. Now, if we think about a level 2, how do you possibly get to a level 2 in MA4? The student starts talking about how, as an experienced analyst in the transportation industry now, they have 21 months, their role has expanded to analyze multiple KPIs. So this is where they start talking about, number 1, I analyze productivity by division as part of a dashboard. I explain productivity by employee, inventory turnover, average cost per SKU. And these are illustrated, folks. So there's multiple KPIs out there, but this is just an example how this student is talking about. These are the 4 or 5 KPIs that I measure on an ongoing basis. And then based on these KPIs, these are the issues that I identify by division, by employee, productivity, how I use these KPIs now to actually make recommendations. So now the student's talking about these KPIs tell me a story, and I work with the different operations folks to help them identify what are the issues: slow moving inventory, perhaps underperforming warehouse employees, perhaps slow moving SKUs in inventory. But all of these KPIs are now being used to help identify an issue that's occurring in the business. Now here, what was considered for the level 2, really on the next slide, duration, but also the number of KPIs, 3 to 5, because this is a non-routine sub-competency, the recommendations that the student was making, the overall complexity, and the autonomy. Now, you'll notice I'm speaking very fast, but we are at 12:48, but I'm going to turn it over back to Amanda to talk about taxation.
And don't worry, folks, the slides will be available to all of you after this, as well as the recording. So hopefully we're not moving too fast, but where, this presentation does apply to you, you're resonating a little bit more. And so taxation, as we discussed, is a competency-based area. And so again, when I talk about taxation, for some of you, that implies chargeable hours. If you do have a role where you're, experiencing some tax work, you may be in a firm environment. And so if you are, we are looking for 500 hours per competency area. So if you can recall, we have tax research, tax compliance, and tax planning. So 500 hours per area for level 2 and 250 hours for level 1. And so for this little area, we didn't necessarily go through tax 1, tax 2, and tax 3 in the ways we did management accounting and financial reporting. Because not many people do get the depth here in tax outside of maybe firm or somebody in a tax role, but more so just things you should consider when you're reporting. And here, we left a little tip in the corner. And basically what we're trying to say here is it's really, really hard to achieve a level 2 in the taxation competency areas unless your role is primarily tax focused. So we often see students who say, I had to research the ITA because we had this issue with payroll about like giving our employees gift cards, and I concluded that, you know, it had to be a taxable benefit, and they assess a level 2. And think about the big picture of your role and how much time you're spending on the area. If you're not spending, you know, majority of your days doing tax work, you're probably not reporting in the right area. Okay, so we just want to avoid that type of misreporting to save you time and to save everybody time in just reviewing and understanding the competencies. And so preparing for, sorry, Hassan, you'll have to go back one more second. A couple things we want to consider for tax compliance, which is what I'm talking about on this slide. You know, things like indirect tax, if you're doing the HST return for your organization, or you filed the CERB or SUS, you know, filing to the CRA, or you're doing some like payroll tax, or maybe you're doing the NPO return, that's all very level 0 tasks. What we're looking for here is if you're preparing T1s, T2s, or T3s, if you're preparing your organization's tax return, you know, what complexities or tax issues were associated with these, what adjustments did you have to make, what schedules did you prepare in order to prepare the return, how many returns have you done, if you're doing personal tax as a result of, you know, firm environment, where are the complexities here? Are they for high net worth individuals, small business owners, etc.? Those are things to consider about complexity. And on the second side, we have just a little bit more information about research and planning. And so in these examples, right, it's a little bit easier, I think, to get tax number 2 if you're preparing returns, because you can outline to us, you know, I've prepared X amount of returns and I've prepared these schedules, and these are why they were difficult or complex, involved analysis. For research and planning, we want to see, and because it's less routine, we want to see at least 3 to 5 examples. If you already catch the drift, that's the consistent message here, 3 to 5 examples of work you completed, okay? And reference the Income Tax Act where possible. Who did you discuss the results with? What was the impact? If you can quantify, like if you measured tax savings in a scenario, please do so. Who did you provide your recommendations to? Again, for research and planning, we want to know that you've consulted multiple resources. Maybe you look to the ITA, maybe in another issue you look to bulletins or case law, etc. But just knowing that you had to, you know, do some analysis, do some research, provide a recommendation, and draw a conclusion on areas that involve complexities. So again, the example I gave earlier about researching, let's say, some payroll rules, or researching yes, like just smaller sort of employee benefit style or smaller tax issues might not get you to a level 1, definitely won't get you to level 2. It would have to be 3 to 5 examples of a little bit more of a complex, deeper analysis, deeper research, more complex conclusion. Okay. And as we're moving a little speedy through, I'm gonna move a little bit faster through audit and assurance. As I recall, there weren't many people on the call who have this depth area. If you need a depth in audit and assurance and you're in public practice, you do need 1250 chargeable hours. That's required. A key thing that I wanted to cover in audit and assurance number 1, if you go to the next slide, Hassan, is that it's really difficult, or it's a common student error, sorry, that we see is students talking about how they're following an internal control and not about how they are assessing an internal control environment. So this is an example of how a student is, you know, making sure there's 2 signatures or making sure there's segregation of duties in their role. That's all great, but if the control was already existing and you're just following it, that's a level 0. And so to get the level 1 or 2 in internal control number 1, audit and assurance number 1, internal control, if you go to the next slide, Hassan, we're looking for what type, essentially, how are you, if we think about the CFE and all of that, the WIR, right? Assess the weakness. How have you identified the weakness in the control? What was the implication of this weakness? And how did you provide a recommendation? Okay, we're looking for 3 to 5 concrete examples, again, of times you analyzed this as part of your job. So again, very difficult to get if you're not in an assurance-based role to a level 2, because it's quite frankly difficult to say that you're spending a majority of your time doing this type of work unless it's a special project. In the next slide, I'm going to just go really quickly again because we have 5 more minutes. We're looking at audit and assurance number 2. Student has significant chargeable hours in audit and review, enough for level 2 transaction, level 2 level here. And if we go to the next slide here, it just discusses what exactly the student is doing to get to the level 2. So there's a lot of risk assessment. There's a lot measuring materiality, assessing the risk of the financial statements, and basically leading a senior on the engagement. So this is an example of a student in a firm in a time where we'd assess level 2, leading the audit engagement, assessing the risks, creating the audit plan, and so forth. And again, if this is for you, I would recommend revisiting this. But again, a big tip here for audit and assurance 2 and 3 is if you are not in an external audit role or an internal audit role, it is very unlikely you're going to achieve these competency areas, because level audit and assurance number 2 is basically planning the assurance engagement and assessing the risk. And audit and assurance number 3 is executing audit procedures, following an audit plan. So if you're not in either of those types of scenarios, it's very difficult to get these areas. And so here's an example of audit and assurance number 3, internal or external audit engagements. And this is a student who works in retail. She's an internal auditor, reports to CPA, and is in 18 months in her role. And so she's outlining in the response following to this, how the student is following a testing plan. So she's giving a lot of great examples of what she's looking for. She's quantifying how many engagements she's been part of. And in this case, she would be considered at a level 1 and very well on her way to a level 2 with more details about the controls tested and how she modified the testing plan and provided some more recommendations. She's at the 18-month mark, so definitely has a lot of duration here. So definitely on her way to level 2. Okay. Also in that response, she discussed the standards and framework and any conclusions she drew and ways she had to follow the approach. And so for level 2, in scenarios like that, you might want to consider, were there any other ways that I could amend the approach or find a better way to test or conclude? Okay, again, very difficult to get this competency area if it's not really part of your main job duties. Okay, I'll pass it on to Raj. Sorry, everyone,
Thank you, Amanda. So I'm going to cover finance. So in this sub-competency, also not very common, we're just showing an example of a student who works for the provincial government. One way to get sub-competency recognition here is through preparing business case proposals. Another way is to actually to analyze the ongoing liquidity, financial ratios, solvency of an organization. But in this case, what I'm going to do is cover a government example where a student works as a financial analyst for a provincial ministry. And in this case, what the student did was they prepared a business case proposal in their first 12 months. The ministry was looking to build new schools in a certain region. So what the student here is explaining is their involvement in this single case business proposal. And some of the things they did, they analyzed the NPV of future cash inflows and outflows for this project. They analyzed different things like future enrollment, average number of children per household, but all of the relevant assumptions. And then based on that, they reviewed the business case proposal to see what are the funding requirements and are they justified for this business case proposal. So the key thing here, it's a future initiative. And this is something where you have to make a go versus a no-go decision. And the student is involved in a business case proposal related to this sub-competency. So if we go to the next slide, this is what was considered duration, about 12 months in the role. The student only provided one example, but it was a good example. So it is good for level 1. How would this student get to a level 2? Really, it's through discussion of multiple examples, but multiple business case proposals that they've been involved in. Up to 3 is what we're looking for. And then also discussing the recommendations as part of the business case proposals that the student prepared. So that's just one example, could apply to the government or to industry. Finally, we did have one example for strategy and governance. We are approaching the last minute of today's discussion, but in this case, this is a student who's a financial analyst working in a bank, about 13 months. So we do consider this low risk. And if we took a look at the example, the student really narrows in on how they prepare and they analyze the governance policy self-assessment document for the bank. And the work that they're doing truly does align with compliance, making sure that the rules are being followed in the governance policy. Keep in mind that the audience here is internal and external. So it's internal and external stakeholders, i.e. the shareholders, the regulatory bodies, board of directors. This doesn't relate to GAAP. And the student also analyzes the entity's governance policies, processes, and code, and prepares this information. So it's very relevant to analyzing the governance mission, vision, and mandates for a highly regulated environment, which is a bank. So this sub-competency definitely makes sense. At a level 2, we would look for similar exposure and more exposure to doing this type of work, so duration as well. So that was the strategy example. Now we are at 101, so a little bit over time. So I think you guys have been asking questions throughout today's presentation. So I will turn it over to Hassan at this point.
Thanks, Raj. So we've recently created some new resources to help with experience reporting for experience verification students. The newly created PE video series is the latest addition to our resources. I would highly suggest reviewing these key resources to help you further understand level 1 versus level 2 technical competencies. In particular, the guiding questions to your technical competency responses is a valuable tool to help you understand level 2 considerations. Thanks for joining us, everyone, today. We hope that you have found this webinar useful and we have answered your practical experience questions. We will be sending out a short survey on both today's presentation and the newly created PE pages, so keep an eye out for that and complete it. We greatly value your feedback. Thank you and have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much, everyone, for attending.
Thanks, everyone, for attending.